Chapter 10, Shadows. I noticed one day that the baby robins in a nest nearby were trying to fly for the first time. Since I was 4.5 at the time, it was very exciting to watch. That excitement quickly turned to fear when one of the small birds flew into the street and then hit the side of a streetcar. I called for my father, who was working close by, to come and help the small bird. Tom Patrick moved into the street. The tiny robin had fallen between the streetcar tracks. He stooped and picked up the tiny figure on his chisel and carried it back to me. He told me that it could not be fixed like my doll. My father looked directly at me and told me the bird was dead and that we would have to bury it. I did not understand. When I began to cry, he told me that death comes to every living creature sooner or later, and that frightened me even more. Then he fumbled for words and finally told me that we would talk about it later. In 1918, the Spanish influenza ravished the United States. It was a disease about which the medical world knew absolutely nothing. The huge auditorium in Oakland, California, the size of 2 football fields, was used as a makeshift hospital and was completely filled, allowing room only for the nurses to care for the stricken. So virulent was this illness that a person contacting the flu would die in 3 or 4 days. In the auditorium, there was a steady flow of flu patients being brought in and corpses being removed to a mortuary nearby. My father never had allowed me to have a friend or invite anyone to my home. Somehow, and I do not know why, my father let me become chums with a girl living next door. The Joneses had come from Wales, England. Their only child, Gwendolyn, was my age, 14. We were close friends and freshmen in high school. On returning home from school one day, my mother put her arms around me and almost whispered, "Gwendolyn is dead." Very quickly in my mind's eye, I saw that little bird fly into the streetcar. But this was my good best friend. I was completely dumbstruck because for the first time in my life, I knew how deeply it hurt when someone you love had died. There were other feelings associated with death in my own experiences that I had to deal with. I learned that man could be inhumane to other people and that there was cruelty to animals. When I was 12, my sister 10, and my brother 5, we lived in a flat on the 2nd story of a 3-story building. On the ground floor lived the owners, the Kindlers. On the ground floor, right at the back, was a small woodshed. A stray cat had adopted the Patrick children, but our pet was not allowed in the house, so she made the shed her home. To my delight, we learned she was going to have babies, and in due time she gave birth to 5 kittens. We children loved the little family and even coaxed from our mother a little extra milk for the cat. As soon as my sister and I came home from school, we would run to see our kittens. One day, as we ran down the sidewalk next to the house, we screamed at what we saw. My little brother, just 4, was in the middle of the walk, his hands bloody and spots of blood on his face. He was crying. All around him were writhing, moaning baby kittens. One appeared to be dead. Not until after Mother had comforted Richard and taken him inside to wash his hands and face did he tell her what happened. Mrs. Kindler had told my little brother to take the cats by their hind feet and bash their heads hard against the wall. From what Richard said, she had made it very clear that he had better do what she said, then she left him alone. Richard, not strong enough to kill the kittens, had just mortally wounded them. My father came home soon after and dispatched all the little creatures. What happened to the mother cat we never knew, but we had our suspicions. At that moment, I wept for my brother and the little lost kittens, but I also knew the feeling of hate. Sometime later, when my father brought home a buck after a successful hunting excursion, I learned that guns caused death. From that moment on, I was terrified of guns. For his entire life as a teenager and adult, my father had a handgun on his person and always had his revolver under his pillow. I did understand that he grew up in an earlier time when guns were an important part of daily life, but my father had not changed with the times, and the presence of his guns had always frightened me. The first and only time I ever touched a gun occurred one summer day when I was visiting the farm of Uncle Joe and Aunt Hattie. It was a lovely spot in the land near Hayward. One day during the week-long stay, Uncle Joe put his rifle in my hands and showed me how to position the gun and aim at a tree in the distance to see if I could hit it. I not only hit the tree, but to my shock and dismay, I had killed a linnet, a beautiful songbird. That was the first and only time I ever held a gun. In later years, as a student at UC Berkeley, I would study in the Bancroft Library until it closed, and then ride the streetcar home. When I came into our house, I was very careful not to suddenly alert my father. If he were to think I was an intruder, surely he would have shot me. While guns and cruelty and hate are difficult issues to deal with, it is death and the long shadow it casts over loved ones that makes it especially difficult and impossible to avoid. The dealing comes from deep within us and involves belief and memory and all those things we spend a lifetime in refining. Just 3 weeks after I began teaching, before any paycheck, I was called home due to the terminal illness of my mother. New places, new people, new position, entirely new world, the overwhelming loss of my mother. I had promised her that from every paycheck I received, I would send her some money so she could do things for herself, for she had gone without many things in order to give us children music lessons. I loved my mother with all my heart, but I fear she probably did not know. I was so wrapped up in my music and college activities that I would give her a hurried kiss on the cheek. Too late now to show Mother how deeply I loved her. Too late. This shadow hung over me for a long while. My students, who were just a few years younger than I, pulled me from the shadow and brought the sunshine. I must add that I cannot speak of my mother's death without remembering the tragic life of my beloved brother. Ending his storm-tossed life, Richard, at age 51, died of a heart attack. In his entire life, Richard had at intervals perhaps a total of 15 years of happiness and love, and that is a generous guess. On a leave of absence from high school, I was taking care of my grandchildren while Alice, Jane, and Bob were working. One Friday afternoon, I packed for a weekend in San Francisco. On the way to the train station, I stopped by the Ekus home to say goodbye to 3-year-old Tommy and adorable Beth, 1 year and 10 days. I reminded Alice Jane that I would be back Monday morning in time to care for the children. The phone rang in my San Francisco hotel room sometime the next afternoon. When I picked up the phone, all I heard was Bob's sobbing voice whispering, "We lost our little girl. Beth died a few minutes ago from a fall." I hung up the phone, left the hotel, and walked as though in a trance. Into the street, not thinking, just moving, hearing nothing, just crying to myself, "It isn't so, it isn't so, it isn't so." Without realizing it, I was in front of the city of Paris. I walked in and sat down to the restaurant. There I saw Frank Schelling, the chef, and a close friend of Bob's. I motioned him to me and then in sobs said, "Beth is dead, our baby gone." Then I turned and walked back to the hotel where Mildred and Jim Cole were waiting to drive me back home to our broken family. Having not been prepared to deal with the loss of my grandchild, I was inconsolable. I remember little of that June 1956 day, but I do recall one moment at the funeral service for our little one. My eyes were on my daughter, for I feared she might collapse. Not so. She appeared erect and composed. I was afraid, her sorrow frozen inside her. Again I learned that when there is a shadow, there must be a bright light somewhere in the background. On October 13th, 1973, my husband had picked apples from our tree down the hillside in our backyard. Once in the house, he cleaned up and, covering a card table with newspapers, was peeling and cutting up the fruit, getting ready for his favorite, an apple pie. Burton was in front of the TV, excitedly involved in a hotly contested World Series baseball game. I was in the yard, pulling overgrown ivy from the fireplace chimney. Every once in a while, I would pop my head in the door and ask how the game was going. He was so interested in the game, he would just wave a hand at me and continue peeling and coring apples. The weather that fall day was glorious. Burton had said before the game began that when it was over, we would drive down Soda Creek Road and see the beautiful colors. It was a date. At about 4:30 p.m., I opened the door and looked toward my husband. I knew before I came to him that he was gone. 2 days after the memorial service and after other members of the family began to return to their regular lives, it began to rain. It was like shedding tears for us. It rained without stopping for 6 long weeks. Life, a grant of time for every living thing, is a panorama of lights and shadows, vivid colors and intense blackness, but not impenetrable. Illness or death cast deep shadows, some barely visible, some a deep, deep black. After the warm darkness of a mother's womb, whether human or animal, a new life begins. From that very moment, death faces each one until the time when death triumphs. At that moment, the spirit is free, but forever a sunshine in the human heart. I have spent most of my life in this beautiful and mountainous country. Perhaps the changing of the seasons is a bit more magnified in a place like this, but I always watch with fascination as the leaves in the fall dry up and gently fall where they become part of the earth, and during the winter nurture new growth, which then bursts forth in the spring and blossoms fully in the summer. I understand full well how all living things are part of this cycle. In the architectural web of life, grandmothers or fathers are expected to cross over into the spiritual world many years before their grandchildren. The oldster goes before the young one. Be that as it may, I, well past 100 years, have outlived 3 of my grandchildren. How can I find the words to convey my heartbreak on losing baby Beth, 1 year old and already walking and talking? Carl, age 34, artistic and creative and always giving. Cindy, age 37, pregnant, blithe spirit of happiness and joy. 3 of my precious grandchildren torn from me. Then, like a fierce blow to my heart, just 7 months after losing Cindy, came that deadly message. Barbsy, my anchor holding me fast in times of distress, had passed away quietly at home. While she was my baby, she was also an accomplished nurse and mother and a wonderful human being. The heart and soul of this 101-year-old grandmother and mother has been brutally bruised. As the years flow by me, I understand and believe that death is a part of life, part of nature and its grand cycle, but I also cling to the belief that death is not the end. It is but an au revoir. See you again. I could hear the trumpet sounds from my bedroom where I was cleaning the closet. My son, whom we all called Bobby, close to 11, was practicing his trumpet in the living room. Burton and the girls were off somewhere. Suddenly I stopped working, alert to a different sound. Still carrying a dress, I rushed to the living room. Before I had time to get through the short hallway, I heard soft crying. I felt a chill. Bobby, sitting on the sofa, was clutching his trumpet to him and sobbing uncontrollably. Big tears rolled down my son's cheeks. Quietly sitting down beside him, I held him close and talked soothingly to comfort him. Once the sobbing quieted, Bobby, in jerky breaths, told me that he had so many questions about the world and was frightened. Where does the sky end? Is heaven in the sky? Why do people die? Where do they go when they die? These questions somehow had rolled into one terrifying monster for Bobby. The concepts of infinity and death are large issues for an adult, so it was easy to understand why he had been overwhelmed. So we sat and quietly talked for a long time. I'm sure I did not provide definitive answers, but the fact that we shared thoughts seemed to comfort him. Eventually, when asked, he said that he could continue to practice, and so he did. I returned to my closet cleaning, and with struggling trumpet sounds again in the distance, I straightened a long dress I had worn once and thought to myself that perhaps just now that amazing torch had been passed from parent to child. Cush, cush, cush. The weaving continues as the shuttle pulls the shadow fibers through the weaving. Interestingly, these fibers are light and delicate, and the shuttle sound is soft. Cush, cush, cush.